I will not take this.
Deborah refused his money and demanded an opportunity instead. 12 years later, she'd refuse a boardroom's verdict and demand the truth instead. Some debts aren't repaid with cash. Some are repaid with loyalty, patience, and a decade of preparation nobody sees coming. Because while Chu Sung believed he was saving a struggling waitress that day, he had no idea he was investing in the only person capable of saving him. And when his empire finally began to fall, she'd be waiting. Rain started before sunrise and showed no intention of stopping. Water streamed down the restaurant windows in endless gray lines. Most people hated days like this. Deborah secretly preferred them because it meant fewer customers and low opportunities for rude people to remind her exactly where she stood in life. At 21 years old, Deborah's world was painfully small, a sick mother and mountain of unpaid bills. She balanced 2 plates on one arm while weaving through crowded tables. Table 6. Table 4 needs coffee. Who forgot the receipt for table 9? The manager's voice echoed constantly through the restaurant. Deborah ignored most of it, because arguing with Mr. Liu only made the day longer. The lunch rush arrived, businessmen, tourists, and so forth. Immediately, Deborah moved from table to table with adequate momentum,
Thank you.
taking orders,
Looks delicious.
delivering
Enjoy
meals,
your meal.
and cleaning spills. Smiling when necessary. By 2:30 p.m., exhaustion already pressed against her shoulders. She had worked 16 straight days. Her mother's medical bills had increased, and rent was due in 5 days. Still, she kept moving. Stopping wasn't an option. Near the front entrance, the restaurant doors swung open. Conversation slowed. A group of men entered, expensive suits. The restaurant manager practically sprinted toward them with a widened smile. "Welcome, gentlemen." The tallest man nodded. Others followed him toward a reserved table near the windows. Deborah didn't recognize most of them except one. Everyone in Seoul knew who Chu Sung was. His companies appeared everywhere. Hotels, shipping firms, and investment groups. Entire sections of the city carried his influence. People whispered about him. Stories followed him. Deborah grabbed a menu and approached the table. The men continued their conversation without acknowledging her. She placed menus in front of them. "Can I start anyone with a drinks?" No answer. The discussion continued. Deborah waited patiently. Eventually, one executive glanced at her. "Coffee." Another nodded. "Same." The orders continued. She wrote them down. Then one of the younger executives leaned back in his chair. His eyes drifted toward her worn sleeves and her shoes. A smile appeared on his face. "Long day." Deborah offered a polite smile. "Every day is a long day." Several men chuckled. The executive reached into his wallet and removed large bills and tossed them onto the table. The money landed near her order pad. "Buy yourself something nicer." A few executives laughed. The manager standing nearby forced a nervous smile. Deborah stared at the money and then at the executive. He clearly expected gratitude. Instead, Deborah picked up the bills and placed them back in front of him. "If you'd like coffee, I'll bring coffee." The table fell silent. "If you'd like service, I'll provide service." Her voice remained calm. "But if you're looking for someone to feel small so you can feel important, you'll need to find another waitress." The executive blinked. For 3 full seconds, the restaurant seemed frozen. Then a low voice broke the silence. "Interesting." Deborah turned. Since entering the restaurant, Chu Sung was looking directly at her. His expression revealed nothing, but his attention was suddenly complete. Deborah met his gaze without lowering her eyes. She couldn't bring herself to look away. Chu Sung studied her for another moment. Then he reached for his coffee cup. "Empty." "Bring the coffee." The tension shattered and conversation resumed. Deborah nodded. "I will bring it immediately." As she walked toward the kitchen, she could feel eyes following her. Something was about to change. The rest of the afternoon should have passed like every other, but every time she crossed the dining floor, she could feel Chu Sung's attention drifting toward her. Enough to make her wonder why. Several times she caught him watching her while his executives spoke. By 5 o'clock, the group finally stood to leave. The younger executive who had embarrassed himself earlier avoided Deborah entirely, while the others followed Chu-sung toward the exit. The manager hurried after them, bowing repeatedly. The restaurant doors closed, and just like that, they were gone. The restaurant room seemed lighter and relaxed. One of the servers immediately rushed over. What was that? Deborah continued collecting dishes. What was what? You practically challenged Chu-sung's people. I answered a customer. The server laughed nervously. No normal person answers people like that. Deborah stacked plates onto a tray. Then maybe more people should. The server shook her head. You're impossible. Deborah smiled faintly. She had heard that, usually from people who wanted her to accept things she knew were wrong. The evening crowd arrived shortly afterward. Another wave of customers. By closing time, her feet ached, her shoulders burned, and she still had a 40-minute bus ride home waiting for her. The manager called her into his office before she left. Mr. Leo sat behind his desk with an expression she immediately recognized. Close the door. Deborah obeyed. Mr. Leo removed his glasses. I need to ask you something. Okay, do you enjoy creating problems? Deborah sighed. Is this about earlier? What do you think? She remained silent. Mr. Leo rubbed his forehead. I spent 10 years building relationships with people who eat in this restaurant. I know. And today, you challenged one of them in front of his colleagues. I challenged nobody. You embarrassed him. He embarrassed himself. The manager stared at her. Then he opened his drawer and removed an envelope. What's that? A complaint. Deborah frowned. A complaint. The executive you spoke to. Not actually, this is from their head. The envelope suddenly looked much heavier. He wants me fired. No, that surprised her. What does he want? Mr. Leo slid the envelope across the desk. Inside was a gold business card, only a name and phone number, Chu-sung. Deborah stared at it. Confused. Why would he leave this? I have no idea. Neither did she, and somehow that bothered her more than if he'd requested her dismissal. The next morning, Deborah arrived at the restaurant before sunrise. She intended to ignore the card. People like Chu-sung lived in a different universe. A phone call would accomplish nothing except create unnecessary complications. Unfortunately, life had other plans. At 9 o'clock, her phone rang, hospital number, and the moment she answered, she knew something was wrong. 20 minutes later, she stood outside her mother's room trying very hard not to panic. The doctor spoke gently. Treatment is working, but the next stage will require additional procedures and cost. Deborah asked, how much? $2 million, the doctor said. For a moment, Deborah couldn't not speak. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Everything she had saved, earned, and borrow wasn't going to be enough. The doctor offered sympathy. Afterward, she sat alone in the hospital hallway staring at the floor. Her phone vibrated. A text message from unknown number. Call me when you've stopped being stubborn. Deborah stared at the screen, then at the gold business card in her wallet. A minute later, she dialed the number. He answered. I was beginning to think you'd never call. How did you get my number? That's your first question. It seems reasonable. A low chuckle sounded through the phone. Meet me. Why? Because I have a proposal. I don't accept proposals from strangers. Yesterday, you told one of my executives exactly what you thought of him. Yes. That's generally not something people do when they're afraid of strangers. Deborah hated that he had a point. Where? He gave her an address. One of the most expensive hotels in Seoul. An hour later, Deborah entered the lobby. A woman escorted her upstairs to a private office where Chu-sung was. The door opened. Chu-sung stood near the windows. He turned as she entered. You came. You sounded confident I would. I was. Deborah crossed her arms. What do you want? That seemed to amuse him. You need money. The words landed harder than she expected. I didn't come here for charity. Good. His answer surprised her. Very few wealthy people understood the difference. He opened a drawer and removed a check. The number written on it made her heart nearly stop, because it would cover everything. He slid it across the desk. Deborah stared at it and then looked up. What do you want in return? Nothing. That's impossible. It's not. It is. Silence settled between them. Finally, Chu-sung leaned back. You really don't trust anyone, do you? No. He pushed the check slightly closer. Take it. Deborah looked at the paper. Her mother's face in her memory, including the unpaid bills. She looked back at Chu-sung and slowly pushed the check away. Chu-sung blinked. For the first time since meeting him, she caught a glimpse of genuine surprise. I can't accept this. You need it. Yes, then take it. No, the room grew quiet. Why? Deborah took a breath. I don't need money. Chu-sung studied her. Then what do you need? Deborah met his eye. Without hesitation. I need an opportunity. For few seconds, neither spoke. Then something changed in Chu-sung's expression. He smiled. Good. Deborah frowned. What does that mean? It means I finally know why you're here. I'm here because you invited me. No, his voice was calm. You are here because everyone else keeps offering you money. He walked back toward the window, looking out over Seoul. And nobody has ever offered you a future. Deborah felt a strange chill, because somehow, despite knowing almost nothing about her, he had understood something very few people ever had. Then he turned and asked a question. How would you like your first real job? Deborah stared at him. What kind of job? She asked. Chu-sung smiled, and for the first time, Deborah wasn't entirely sure whether accepting would be the smartest decision she ever made. Or the most dangerous. Deborah barely slept that night, not because of excitement, but of suspicion. People did not wake up one morning as waitresses and go to sleep with job offers from men like Chu-sung. Life simply didn't work that way. At least, it never had for her, yet the offer remained real. The contract sat on her small kitchen table. A position within one of Chu-sung's corporate divisions. Training program and housing assistance. A salary 10 times what she earned at the restaurant. Every line seemed impossible. Her mother read it twice before looking up. You should take it. Deborah stared at the papers. What if there's a catch? Her mother smiled faintly. There's always a catch. That wasn't exactly reassuring. What if I fail? Her mother's expression softened. Then you'll fail after being given a chance. That's still better than never getting one. The words followed Deborah all the way into the morning, and 3 days later, she arrived through the glass doors of Metro Investment. The headquarters tower rose over central Seoul like a monument, everything Deborah had spent her life observing from the outside. Now she stood inside, and immediately felt out of place. She felt small. A woman guided her toward orientation, where several new recruits sat around a conference table. Most came from prestigious universities. One young man finally asked, "Which university did you attend?" Deborah knew exactly what he was really asking. I didn't. The young man nodded slowly, as though that confirmed something, but Deborah ignored him. The first few weeks were difficult. Because she lacked experience, she didn't know corporate language, office politics, and she had never seen financial reports thicker than telephone books. Every day felt like trying to drink from a fire hose. Still, she learned. Faster than anyone expected, she arrived early, stayed late, and asked questions others were too proud to ask. Read reports after work and memorized organizational structures. Slowly, the confusion began to fade. And once Deborah understood a system, she became very difficult to fool. 6 weeks into the program, she noticed something unusual, a small inconsistency. The next morning, she brought her findings to her supervisor. He glanced at the documents. Looks fine. It isn't. It passed audit, I know. Then what's the problem? Deborah tapped the page. The mistake. What mistake exactly? The supervisor looked confused. Deborah sighed. Trying to explain intuition was difficult, especially when that intuition came from years of people trying to hide things. The supervisor handed the papers back. Focus on your assigned work. Conversation over. Deborah returned to her desk feeling frustrated but not convinced. Something was there. She could feel it but couldn't just prove it yet. 2 days later, someone appeared beside her desk. A man in his 40s, impeccably dressed. Deborah. She looked up. Yes, my name is Yimin. Nearby employees immediately straightened. The reaction told her everything she needed to know. Important. She stood. Yimin extended his hand. I hear you've been causing trouble. Deborah blinked. Excuse me. His smile widened. The shipping reports. Oh, now she understood. Yimin gestured toward the hallway. Walk with me. Deborah followed anyway. They entered an executive conference room. To her surprise, Chu-sung sat inside. The moment Deborah entered, his attention shifted toward her. The same assessing look she remembered from the restaurant. Yimin closed the door behind them. Deborah remained standing. Then Chu-sung slid a folder across the table. The reports. Deborah looked down, her stomach tightened. More documents with same records. Along with several she had never seen. You reviewed these? Yes. And, she hesitated. This was a dangerous moment, Deborah's strengths. I think someone changed the numbers. Yimin leaned back. Without evidence, I didn't say I could prove it. Then how can you know? Deborah looked directly at him. Because people leave fingerprints. Yimin smiled politely. These aren't fingerprints. No. Deborah tapped the documents. They're habits. She continued. The corrections happen at the same time every month. Yimin's smile faded slightly. The same formatting, she pointed again. The same adjustment patterns. Another page, the same approval path. Chu-sung remained silent, listening. Finally, Yimin spoke. Interesting theory. Deborah shrugged. It's not a theory. Then what is it? It's a warning. The room fell quiet for a brief moment. Something unreadable flickered across Yimin's face, gone almost immediately, but Deborah noticed. Chu-sung unexpectedly stood without a word. He walked toward the windows, looking out over the city. After minutes passed, he finally turned and spoke 4 words. A deeper audit. Yimin blinked. Chairman, run it. His tone ended the discussion immediately. Yimin inclined his head. Of course. But for the first time since entering the room, Deborah detected something beneath his calm exterior, which was discomfort. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Deborah reached the door, Chu-sung's voice stopped her. Stay. Yimin exited and the door closed. Chu-sung studied her quietly, then asked a question. How did you see it? Deborah shrugged again. I pay attention. No, he shook his head. Lots of people pay attention. He walked around the desk. You see things. Statement landed differently. Deborah folded her arms. Is that a good thing? A faint smile touched his face. It depends. On what? On whether you're looking at my enemies. He paused and added. Or me. Since joining Metro Investment, Deborah wasn't entirely certain whether she had entered a company or stepped onto a battlefield, and somewhere beyond the office walls, hidden beneath years of loyalty and trust, Yimin was already beginning to understand something dangerous. The ex-waitress was noticing things she was never supposed to see. The audit found at least nothing officially. 3 weeks after Deborah's warning, a team of accountants delivered a report thick enough to stop a door. The conclusion occupied less than half a page. No evidence of misconduct found. Most people considered the matter closed, but Deborah did not. She sat in the cafeteria staring at the report while dozens of employees flowed around her. The more Deborah thought about it, the more uncomfortable she became. A shadow fell across her table. She looked up. It was Yimin. He smiled politely. Still thinking about the audit, Deborah folded the report. Sometimes, most people would move on. Not most people. No, his smile widened slightly. You definitely aren't. He sat across from her. You're disappointed, he observed. The audit didn't answer my questions. It answered the company's questions. Those aren't always the same thing. For a brief moment, silence settled between them, then Yimin laughed softly. You remind me of someone. Who? Younger Chu-sung. That surprised her. Doubt he spent much time questioning authority. Yimin's eyes gleamed. Actually, that's exactly what he did. Answer lingered with her long after he left. Over the next 2 years, Deborah rose faster than anyone expected. Her role expanded. New responsibilities and challenges. People gradually stopped seeing a former waitress and they started seeing someone dangerous professionally. The kind of employee who entered a meeting and quietly identified problems everyone else had missed. Executives began seeking her opinion, managers requested her involvement, and different departments competed to recruit her. The more she learned, the more valuable she became, and throughout it all, Chu Sung only watched. One evening, Deborah entered his office carrying a market analysis report. Chu Sung barely looked up. "What are you here to criticize today?" She sat down. "I haven't decided yet." His lips twitched, almost a smile. Deborah placed the report on his desk. "Your expansion plan." "What about it? It's too aggressive." He finally looked up. "Interesting. You disagree?" "No," that caught her. Chu Sung leaned back. "I was waiting for someone to say it." Deborah blinked. "Then why proceed?" "Because everyone else told me it was brilliant." The answer she didn't like. "You know they're afraid to disagree." "I know." "Then why listen?" Chu Sung studied her for a moment. "Power creates a strange disease." "What disease?" "People start editing themselves around you." His voice remained calm. "Eventually, finding an honest opinion becomes more difficult than finding money." Deborah considered that. For the first time, she glimpsed the loneliness hidden beneath authority. By the 5th year, Deborah occupied an office larger than the apartment where she had once lived. Her mother's health had improved. She was able to clear the entire bills and whatever debt they owed. The constant fear of survival had finally loosened its grip, yet success brought a different problem. The higher she climbed, the more often she encountered Yimin. Board meetings and so forth. He seemed to be everywhere, always smiling and helpful, and that bothered her. One afternoon, she found herself reviewing a proposed acquisition with him. For nearly 40 minutes, Yimin supported every recommendation Chu Sung made, not one objection. As the meeting ended, Deborah finally asked, "You agree with him a lot." Yimin looked amused. "He's usually right. Usually isn't always." "True. Then why never challenge him?" Yimin smiled. "Because my role is to support the king." Deborah watched him carefully. There are different ways to support someone. Smile never moved, of course. Yet he offered nothing else, and somehow that troubled her more than an argument would have. Months later, she finally voiced her concern. Chu Sung listened patiently while reviewing documents. When she finished, he continued reading. "Suspicious of Yimin?" "Yes, because he never disagrees with you." Chu Sung looked up. A familiar conversation, one they had apparently reached years later than she expected. "That's called loyalty." Deborah shook her head. "That's called strategy." His eyebrow lifted. "Interesting. Continue." "Loyal people tell you things you don't want to hear." She folded her arms. "Everyone else in this company is terrified of upsetting you. Yimin isn't." Room grew quiet. Chu Sung considered her words and slowly set down his pen. "Do you have evidence?" "No." "Then you have a feeling." "I have experience." That distinction mattered, at least to her. Chu Sung said to her, "You know what your problem is?" Deborah sighed. "There are so many possibilities." A rare chuckle escaped him. Then his expression became serious. "You see threats everywhere." "I think you do." "Sometimes people are exactly what they appear to be." Deborah wanted to argue, but instead she remained silent. Because deep down she recognized something uncomfortable. Things felt wrong. She couldn't explain it or prove it, and that frightened her. 3 years later, an opportunity arrived. One capable of changing everything, an international business fellowship. One of the most prestigious programs in the world. Hundreds applied and a handful were selected. When Deborah received the acceptance letter, she read it 3 times, then sat quietly for almost an hour. Because accepting meant leaving Seoul and Metro investment, the life she had spent years building. The fellowship would place her in the United States, advanced education, and a global experience including leadership training. Everything she had once dreamed about, yet when she finally walked into Chu Sung's office with the news, she felt strangely uncertain. He read the letter carefully and looked at her. "When do you leave?" 3 months. Answer hung between them. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Chu Sung nodded. "You should go." The simplicity surprised her. "That's it? What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Maybe resistance or disappointment." Instead, he simply folded the letter. "You've outgrown this place." The words landed harder than she expected because they were kind, and kindness from Chu Sung often arrived disguised as honesty. Deborah looked away, toward the city and the future waiting. "Will the company be okay?" A strange question, and yet it slipped out anyway. "Company survived before you arrived." "That's not what I asked." A faint smile touched his face. "No, it wasn't. We'll be fine." Behind years of loyalty. Decades of trust. Carefully balanced reports and flawless audits. A crack had already begun spreading through the foundation of everything Chu Sung had built. 3 months later, Deborah boarded a plane for America. As Seoul disappeared beneath the clouds, she looked out the window and felt a strange unease she couldn't explain. It felt less like leaving home and more like leaving something unfinished. Far below, in a boardroom high above the city, Yi-min watched the aircraft's departure time appear on his phone. Then he quietly locked the screen. His smile was genuine. The only person asking the wrong questions was finally gone. The first winter Deborah spent in America was the loneliest season of her life because she had too many. For the first time, no one knew her story, that she had once carried coffee trays through crowded restaurants, and all she had gone through in life. In New York, she was simply another ambitious young professional trying to build a future. The anonymity felt strange. She immersed herself in everything finance, corporate law, and international business strategy. By her 3rd year abroad, companies were competing for her attention. By her 5th, she had become one of the youngest strategic consultants in a global advisory firm. By her 7th, she was advising corporations worth billions. By her 9th, people twice her age stopped underestimating her. Back in Seoul, Metro investment was thriving. On paper, revenue reached record highs, and expansion accelerated. Industry magazines celebrated Chu-sung's leadership and investors praised his vision. The media called it a golden era, and for a while it genuinely seemed to be. The company had never been larger, never more influential, yet beneath the surface, something else was growing. Yi-min's operation had evolved over years, small adjustments and minor transfers. A parallel financial network, one built inside Metro Investment without Metro Investment realizing it existed. Yi-min had spent years building systems, and with Deborah gone, fewer people were asking uncomfortable questions. One evening, nearly 10 years after leaving Seoul, Deborah attended a corporate governance conference in Chicago. The event itself was unremarkable, the usual parade of executives pretending not to be exhausted. She was reviewing conference materials in her hotel room when something caught her attention. A company name, nothing more. Deborah read it again. A strange feeling settled into her. The company was called Meridian East Logistics, exactly the kind of name designed not to attract attention, but something about it felt familiar. Deborah opened her laptop, started searching corporate filings and donorship records. The process consumed hours. By sunrise, she sat motionless in front of the screen because she had found something and Deborah had spent her entire life pulling threads. The company traced through multiple holding structures. Each layer obscured the next. The structure was sophisticated and deliberately confusing, but eventually every path led toward Asia, Korean. However, indirectly, to Metro Investment, Deborah leaned back and was thinking. The feeling returned, stronger now. Something was wrong, very wrong. She almost called Chu-sung, but she held her phone in her hand for nearly 20 minutes, then she put it away. Calling too early could destroy everything. If there was truly a hidden network operating inside Metro Investment, warning the wrong person could alert everyone involved. She needed evidence, not instincts. So she started digging. One company became 3, 3 became 8, and 8 became 16. The pattern expanded across multiple countries. Each discovery led to another. Deborah continued on her career work while still investigating. No one knew, meanwhile. The first signs of trouble began appearing in Seoul, small things at first. A delayed acquisition, an investor withdrawing unexpectedly, and an overseas partnership collapsing without explanation. Meetings became investigations. First time in years, executives inside Metro Investment started hearing unfamiliar words. Words that made shareholders nervous, and nervous shareholders rarely stayed loyal. One afternoon, Chu-sung reviewed a financial briefing in silence. Several board members sat around the table. Yi-min occupied his usual seat nearby. The presentation ended. The room waited. Finally, Chu-sung looked up. How serious is this? An executive cleared his throat. Still evaluating the situation. Answer irritated him. Nobody seemed capable of explaining where the problems originated, only that they existed and were spreading. Chu-sung's gaze shifted toward Yi-min. What do you think? Yi-min folded his hands, the picture of professionalism. We'll identify the source. How long? As long as necessary. Several board members nodded. Only one person would have noticed the flaw in that answer, and she was thousands of miles away. 2 months later, she found the first direct connection. The authorization trail passed through an executive account inside Metro Investment. Deborah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Finally, she had an evidence, though not enough to expose anyone, but strong to prove her instincts had been right all along. Someone inside the company was building something hidden and large. And the deeper she investigated, the more often one name appeared nearby. Same influence, always close to Yimin, but never close enough to accuse. Deborah leaned back in her chair. The city lights of Manhattan glittered beyond the window. Somewhere across the ocean, a man who had once offered her an opportunity was standing at the center of a storm he couldn't see. And since in 12 years, Deborah realized something unsettling. She hadn't truly left Metro Investment behind. Part of her had simply continued watching from a greater distance. If she was going to step back into his world, she needed certainty, and somewhere in Seoul, that certainty was arriving faster than anyone realized. Because the hidden network Yimin had spent years constructing was no longer content to steal quietly. It was preparing for something bigger and capable of destroying Chu Sung's empire completely. The collapse did not begin with an explosion. It began with a question. Those were always the dangerous ones. The first came from a regulator reviewing a routine filing. The second came from an investor conducting due diligence. The third came from a journalist who had spent 20 years uncovering financial scandals and possessed the unfortunate habit of refusing easy answers. Separately, they meant nothing. Together, they created pressure. Metro Investment's leadership team found itself answering the same inquiry repeatedly. Why did certain overseas transactions appear to move through unusually complex structures? No one had a satisfactory answer. Not because answers didn't exist, because the individuals responsible for investigating the problem were unknowingly reporting through channels influenced by the very person who had created it. Every internal review somehow reached the same conclusion. One rainy evening, Chu Sung remained alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. A report lay open on his desk. Another investigation, an incomplete explanation. His phone buzzed. A message from Yimin. The compliance team has completed their review. No major concerns identified. Chu Sung stared at the screen and set the phone down. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, the message wasn't satisfying to him. He thought about Deborah. A memory from years ago surfaced unexpectedly. You agree with him too much. At the time he had dismissed it, perhaps because it was easier to dismiss. Yimin was someone he had trusted for over 20 years. But this moment uncertainty settled beside him. A week later, Deborah finally found the document, the one she had been chasing for nearly 18 months. The one hidden behind international subsidiaries, offshore registrations, legal intermediaries, and layers of corporate camouflage. It appeared almost accidentally, a filing uploaded to a foreign database. Each path reached the same destination, Yimin. The network belonged to him, or at least enough of it did, to prove he was involved. Deborah stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes, because after 12 years of uncertainty, she finally possessed something she had never had before, proof. And proof changed everything. She immediately mailed every evidence she has gathered so far to Chu Sung, when Chu Sung saw the email and read them. He felt devastating because for over 2 decades, he has trusted the wrong man. His empire was standing on compromised ground. 3 weeks later, emergency board meetings began. Investors demanded explanations, stock prices falling, headlines multiplied. Every news outlet wanted answers and rival wanted blood. The atmosphere inside Metro Investment changed overnight. People who had spent years feeling secure now checked the news before checking email. Executives whispered in hallways. Lawyers occupied entire conference floors, and somewhere in the center of that chaos sat Yimin, still acting like the most loyal man in the building. Until the morning, everything changed. The boardroom was packed. Directors, attorneys, and senior executives. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance. Inside, tension filled every seat. Yimin arrived exactly on time as always. The meeting began financial updates, regulatory concerns, and public relations strategies. Then Chu Sung stood. The room quieted immediately. He placed a leather folder on the table. Yimin's smiles remained intact. What is this? King? Chu Sung looked directly at him, for the first time in years, not as a colleague or trusted lieutenant, but as an opponent. Evidence. Room froze. Smile finally disappeared from Yimin's face, and enough for Deborah, watching remotely via the conference network cam from thousands of miles away, to realize that the war she had spent 12 years preparing for had finally begun. The downfall of Metral investment had been scheduled carefully with patience, but Yi Min had made one mistake be thinking Deborah stop paying attention the moment she left Seoul. The moment the folder touched the council table, every person present understood one thing. This was no longer a business problem, but a survival problem. The atmosphere changed instantly. Directors who had entered expecting another damage control meeting suddenly sat straighter. Attorneys stopped taking notes and executives exchanged nervous glances. Across the table, Yi Min looked at the leather folder with the calm focus of a man recognizing an enemy he had hoped would remain hypothetical. Chu Sung opened the folder and spread several documents onto the table. It contains bank records, ownership filings, authorization trails, and transfer histories. Each one carefully verified and impossible to dismiss casually. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in a boardroom. Finally, Yi Min spoke. "What exactly am I looking at?" His voice remained steady, yet something had changed. "Your work." No one moved. Yi Min glanced down at the documents, then back up into the surprise of everyone present. He smiled. "King," Yi Min said calmly, "if these documents are the foundation of your accusation, then you've already lost." The room stirred, board members exchanged confused looks. One attorney leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Yi Min folded his hands. "It means someone has manipulated evidence." Chu Sung's eyes narrowed. "You expect us to believe that?" "I don't need you to believe it." Yi Min looked around the room. "Only need regulators to question it." That was when the real danger revealed itself, because Yi Min wasn't trying to prove innocence. He was creating uncertainty. One board member cleared his throat. "Do you have proof?" Yi Min reached into his briefcase and placed his own folder on the table. A second narrative, and suddenly the room had two versions of reality. 3 days later, the story exploded national news with the headlines multiplied by the hour. Metro Investment executive accused board member of fabricating evidence. Power struggle inside Korea's most influential empire company. Who is telling the truth? That last question became the most dangerous, because nobody seemed capable of answering it. The company's stock price dropped another 17% in 4 days. Every news broadcast became a trial, and for the first time in decades, Chu Sung found himself losing control of the story. The worst moment arrived 2 weeks later, a formal regulatory hearing. The government wanted answers like why's the investors, including the public, and Chu Sung had none that could be delivered quickly enough. The evidence existed, but proving it required time. Months, and time was exactly what he didn't have. Outside, hundreds gathered, hoping to witness history. Meanwhile, inside, Chu Sung sat at the center of a storm, and across the room sat Yi Min, still calm, presenting himself as the loyal executive falsely accused by a desperate organization, and to many watching, it was working. Halfway across the world, Deborah watched the hearing from New York. Deborah barely listened, because she already knew what everyone else was missing. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about narrative. Who would define the truth before the truth actually arrived? And suddenly she realized something. The evidence alone would not save Chu Sung, not anymore. The situation had evolved beyond documents and audits. What Metro Investment needed now was someone capable of connecting everything, showing not just what happened, but how it happened, explaining 12 years of deception in a way the world could understand. Her eyes drifted toward a passport sitting on a nearby shelf. For several seconds she stared at it, then made a decision. 3 hours later, Deborah stepped off a plane in Seoul. The city looked different, or perhaps she had changed. A black sedan waited outside the airport. The ride into the city passed mostly in silence. As familiar streets appeared outside the window, memories surfaced unexpectedly. By the time the car reached Metro Investment headquarters, reporters already surrounded the building. Deborah entered through a private entrance. Security escorted her upstairs. Employees trying desperately to hold the company together. Finally, she reached the executive floor. The boardroom doors stood closed. Inside, another emergency meeting was underway. Voices echoed through the walls, arguments, accusations, and fear. The sounds of people realizing the future might not resemble the past. Deborah placed one hand on the door and opened it. The room fell silent immediately. Every eye turned toward her, and at the far end of the table sat Chu Sung. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his eyes widened slightly. Another impossible moment and life-changing decision. "My God," one board member whispered. Another leaned forward. "Who is she?" Nobody answered. Deborah walked calmly toward the center of the room, set a thick stack of documents on the table, an entire archive of 12 years of evidence. She looked directly at the people deciding the future of Metro investment and spoke the sentence that changed everything. "You've all been asking the wrong question." The room froze. A member frowned. "What question?" Deborah's gaze shifted toward Yimin. For the first time since she entered, his confidence wavered. Then Deborah answered, "The question isn't whether the evidence is real. The question is why the evidence exists at all." Since the crisis began, Yimin looked afraid and lost control of the moment of pretending, and Deborah saw it. The instinctive calculation of a man suddenly realizing there might be information he hadn't accounted for, and that was all she needed. Because every empire of deception eventually collapses for the same reason. The liar knows exactly what everyone else knows, but never what everyone else might discover tomorrow. Deborah remained standing while the boardroom remained silent. Outside, reporters crowded every entrance. Across the country, investors waited for answers. Deborah intended to provide them. "You've spent months arguing about documents," she said calmly. "Which documents are real and which are false? That was the trap." Few directors frowned. "What trap?" Deborah opened the first binder. Yimin wanted the discussion to focus on evidence. Another page, because evidence can be challenged. Another page, evidence can be questioned. Another page, evidence can be delayed. Then she looked directly at Yimin, but behavior leaves a different trail. Room grew quiet again. For nearly 2 hours, Deborah walked the board through 12 years of history. Not transactions or paperwork, but patterns, relationships, and human behavior. The things most investigations overlooked. Together they formed a map, and every road led toward the same destination. Yimin. One board member slowly removed his glasses, while another stopped taking notes entirely. A government investigator requested copies of several exhibits, because the story finally made sense, not as a financial scandal, but as a long-term strategy, a strategy that had begun years before anyone realized a game was being played. Deborah reached the final section and stopped. Yimin sat motionless, no confidence, just silence. "There's one question nobody has asked," Deborah said. A director leaned forward. "What question?" She turned toward Yimin. "Why?" The room froze. Because she was right. Everyone had been focused on proving what happened. Almost nobody had asked why it happened, and motive changes everything. Then unexpectedly, he laughed, not loudly, almost tiredly. The sound unsettled everyone, including Chusung, because after months of denial, after endless counterarguments, after all the careful legal maneuvering, Yimin suddenly looked exhausted. "You really want to know why?" His voice echoed through the room. Nobody answered. Yimin looked toward Chusung. "I gave you 30 years. I protected your empire and company." His gaze never left Chusung. "I solved your problems." Another pause. "I execute every order you place." His voice hardened. "Every time someone praised you, they forgot the people standing behind you." Room absorbed the words slowly. Yimin continued. "I was there when all of this was built and what this company became." His eyes drifted toward the windows. "And no matter how much I accomplished," a bitter smile appeared, "it was always your name on the building." Chusung listened without interruption. "What was your plan?" Deborah asked. Yimin laughed again, this time sadly. "The same plan every overlooked man eventually invents. The thing you helped build." His answer landed heavily. The legal consequences arrived quickly. Structure that had taken 12 years to build began collapsing in less than weeks. Yimin was shut out from the organization, and Chusung told him directly, "I will spare your life this one time, and I don't ever want to see you. If I by any chance set my eyes on you, that would be your last day on Earth." Yimin disappeared from public view, and shortly formal charges followed. One evening, weeks after the crisis ended, Chusung sat alone in the same office where he had first offered Deborah a job. A knock sounded. "Come in." Deborah entered carrying reports. For a moment they simply looked at one another. Finally Chusung smiled. "You saved the Empire Company." Deborah placed the reports down. "No." He raised an eyebrow. "No, I saved the truth." She sat across from him. "What happens next is your responsibility." Answer made him laugh. The room felt lighter afterward. Months later, the board offered Deborah an executive position with an enormous salary, including significant authority and influence in the empire. She declined the offer, to the complete confusion of nearly everyone involved. "You earned this," one director argued. Deborah smiled. "I know." "Then why refuse?" the executive asked again. "What do you need?" Deborah looked toward the city and answered exactly as she had 12 years ago. "Opportunity." Foundation launched 6 months later. Scholarships, workforce training, small business, support programs, and career pathways for young people from difficult backgrounds. Thousands applied during the first year. Hundreds found jobs. Dozens launched companies of their own. The impact grew. Deborah and Chusung stood outside a modest training center funded by the foundation. Young people filled the building, learning and working. Chusung watched quietly, then spoke. "Do you know what still bothers me?" Deborah smiled. "There are so many possibilities." A rare chuckle escaped him. "True." He looked toward the students. "I thought I gave you a job." Snow drifted gently across the street. Deborah followed his gaze. "You did." He shook his head. Understanding finally settled into place. "I gave you a chance." She looked at him, the same man who had walked into a restaurant years ago and who had changed her life. "Yes," she said quietly, "you did." For a moment neither spoke, then Chusung asked the question that had followed him for years. "If you could go back," he hesitated, "would you still accept?" Deborah looked through the glass, then she smiled. The answer was immediate. "Only if you would still offer." A second, the powerful Mafia businessman and feared leader disappeared, leaving only a man unexpectedly moved by a simple truth. Secret Mafia love brings you the stories you haunt for, and I remain Charles, the director and writer of the stories.